Welcome to this very special episode of the Ideas Factory. We are in the middle of a pandemic. The COVID-19 storm is still in its infancy, but the incalculable human and economic loss due to the spread of the virus from China promises to shake up the world geopolitically and economically. With the 21-day India lockdown, the largest shutdown in history, nearly half of the global population is now under some form of lockdown. And the popular social media hashtag of China lied and people died is gaining more traction as China's disastrous cover-up allowed the virus to travel far and wide, and it is now no longer a secret. Meanwhile, the COVID-19 has cast a very unflattering light on the only institution that has been tasked with providing global health leadership, the WHO, under Dr. Tedros, the first chief of the WHO, who's not a doctor. The institution's credibility has taken a beating, and the full economic, cyclical, and structural effects are not quite visible yet. But in any case, they will be gigantic, and some of the big questions that we are going to look at today in this episode is, will COVID-19 be a geopolitical game changer? Has the pandemic exposed the fault lines in our global order? It has exposed the weaknesses of the global governance in the area of health. And will it lead to a consolidation of China as a global power? Another big question is, will China's relation with the West be normal or go back to normal once this crisis is over? And I have with me Dr. Harsh Pant to discuss all of this. Dr. Harsh, first of all, there is a lot of question on the legitimacy of the international institutions now, and it seems that the legitimacy is waning, especially when the UNSC cannot even hold a meeting on COVID-19 because most of these organizations seem to be towing the China line. There is a big question, and there is a legitimate and a valid question. What is the point of having such institutions then? What is your opinion?
Well, Naghma, these are extraordinary times, as you put it. And I think what we are witnessing is unraveling of the global governance structures that were created post-Second World War, and in some ways fundamentally altering our perception of how the world is going to evolve over the next years and the next decades. I think the process was already underway. There were too many tensions around the world. There were too many geopolitical fault lines that were beginning to play up, especially as China's rise was already accentuating some of these fault lines. Now, of course, with this pandemic and the way China has dealt with it, the way West is dealing with it, and the way I think the global infrastructure has been found completely wanting in managing this challenge. So we are now at a stage where it seems that we are asking some of these fundamental questions. We have been asking these questions for a long time now, but we have come to a point, perhaps, which is an inflection point, which will lead us to take one way or the other, because we can't continue with the same on the same path. So clearly, as you point out, look, the United Nations Security Council, the WHO, even G20, which was created after the financial crisis, is now, looks completely dilapidated at this point. It has not come out. It has not been able to come up with a coherent response. The G7 could not come out with a communique. The fault lines are becoming very, very visible. And I think at the core of this is this question about China. How do you deal with a rising China? And how do you deal with a China that even on a so-called, traditionally pandemics were considered to be soft security issues, or rather non-traditional security issues. Today, that non-traditional is becoming a fundamental security challenge for the world, and the way China has responded to it does not inspire any confidence, I think, in a large part of the world, that under Chinese leadership, if at all that's something that China is striving for, we would be entering into an era where perhaps these kind of problems could be dealt with on a global level. Everyone knows that we need global institutions to fight these problems. Everyone knows that we need global coordination. But look how difficult it is becoming to get to that basic understanding of how we want to move forward. And I think that's where we are at the moment, and perhaps once the immediate aftermath of this crisis subsides, the leaders begin to reflect on larger issues of global politics and global governance, we will find that a lot of them would conclude that the old structures perhaps it's no longer possible to continue with them. We need a fresh governance structure in the world.
You rightly point out that we need a fresh governance structure because the United Nations leadership itself was found wanting. The UN Secretary General has been extremely slow in coordinating any kind of global response to the situation and has all but abdicated organization's responsibilities. And then we saw the WHO, the World Health Organization, that has been towing China's line, and the WHO, in fact, has made big blunders. The WHO changed its position only after China belatedly admitted the transmission between humans. The WHO was putting out tweets which were saying that there is no evidence of it being transmitted from human to human, which is a big, big blunder. So the WHO right now, the way it has helped China in its cover-up, what does that show about China's rising power and how is it controlling organizations like the WHO?
Well, it shows that we have to be aware of the underlying politics, even in institutions that are supposedly technical and functional. So WHO is supposed to be an institution that is supposed to look at health issues where you don't look at it through the lens. Traditionally, you don't look at it through the lens of great power politics. You look at it through the lens of how the world can coordinate its responses if such a situation actually arises, and how you can help the most vulnerable. In this case, it seems as if the WHO is towing the line of the most powerful. And here lies the conundrum that we were all talking about. Remember, we were a few before this pandemic actually came. Struck the kind of blow it is striking today. We were all talking about the need to change the global governance architecture, the need to give the rising powers greater voice. And I think that was being reflected in the way some of the institutions were evolving in the UN Security Council, and even in institutions like G7 became G8, became G20. You were looking at new institutions being created. But what has happened in the WHO's case is that an institution that was supposed to look out for the most vulnerable, for the most impoverished countries in the world, you saw it towing the Chinese line, hook, line, and sinker to begin with. And I think by doing that, it has reduced its credibility to an extent that now countries who at one point were looking, despite all the problems with globalization, used to look at international institutions, especially like WHO, with a degree of credibility, would now withdraw, would now erect barriers, would now depend on themselves, their own facilities, their own institutions, to give them the kind of information that they relied on WHO. And I think this is extremely serious because great power politics is today becoming the defining feature of our times in ways that it is also redefining the contours of some of these institutions that were supposed to be, if not above, then at least beyond the zero-sum mentality of great power politics. But what we have seen today is that is completely changing, and we cannot rely on these institutions. We cannot rely on organizations such as even WTO, and their credibility is going down. And I think with that, the whole debate on globalization, on global institutions, on global governance structures would be, again, back to the center once this immediate crisis subsides a bit.
Absolutely. Like you pointed out, the whole big question on globalization and an increasingly interconnected and interdependent world. But we also see how it has again come to the point where readers are talking about their for example, America first. In the initial days, Trump tried to buy a small German company and get it to make vaccines just for America. But America has been also, in a way, the leadership has been absent. After inflicting the coronavirus pandemic on the world, we see that China is engaged in lies and intimidation and trying to project itself as a leader. It can sense an opening and is trying to exploit it, but the US leadership has been missing and it's grappling with the virus at home. It doesn't have medical supplies. We are getting reports from New York where the nurses do not have, in America, in New York, do not have masks and protective gears. So the American leadership is totally not there.
I think decades and years from now, when you look back at this crisis, you would see this as a vivid example of how the West ceded the leadership role that it once played in the world. And that role was given on a platter to the Chinese, despite all the problems that they've created on the global governance structures that we were discussing earlier. So clearly what China has done is trying to find that breach in the space that is available to make a case for its own leadership. And it can easily do that because you have a West that is completely out of kilter. You have America, as you point out, where Donald Trump cannot make his mind as to what he should be doing about this serious problem. You have a situation in the European Union, where the European Union, which was supposed to be this great exemplar of a regional institution, does not have the willingness and the ability to reflect on what is happening to its member states. So there comes China, and China is saying, look, I have managed it so well. My model is much better than what you are proposing. So clearly at a number of levels, China is projecting itself as a leader, as a better alternative to a lot of the world, despite, and the irony is that despite in the first place creating this problem and making sure that its lack of transparency continues to engender these problems. So we are living in quite interesting times, and the Chinese are so used to saying that here is a country that is responsible for this crisis in many ways, is now using this leadership vacuum around the world and projecting itself as a savior of the world. And I think this will have grave consequences in terms of the ideational norms that we propose. So, for example, the whole idea of institutions like WHO, institutions like United Nations being relatively more transparent has been one of the founding principles of these organizations, that you needed that kind of transparency to be able to reflect on what the concerns are. But as China's role grows, as China's opaque working culture permeates these institutions, we will find that some of that will have a bearing on how we deal with global governance issues, how we deal with issues like pandemics, how we deal with issues like terrorism, etc. And I think that is something that we have to be very cognizant of as a country that is very close to China. Also, as a country that has a stake in what kind of international institutions are coming up and what role we can play there.
Harsh, what kind of a paradigm shift do you see of the geopolitical paradigm shift once we are done, once we have dealt with COVID-19? One of the hypotheses, like you were talking about right now, is that the current pandemic decisively will shift the balance of power towards China. Even now, we can see that China created the crisis, but China is using it now and projecting itself as a savior. India has just ordered about 10,000 ventilators from China, and it is selling its testing kits to many countries where it's a different matter that those testing kits were faulty. So it's a very ironical situation. Will we see a clear paradigm shift after this is over, the pandemic?
Yes, I think part of it is that there is, at least in the short to medium term, countries don't see any alternative. I mean, if you don't buy from the Chinese, where do you go? And I think that is something that I think the world has to reflect upon, especially those that have the means should reflect upon. That why have they ceded this responsibility? Why is that the West at one point used to talk of global leadership, today is looking so inwards? It has become so inward looking that there is no attempt even by some of the most richest countries in the world to initiate a global response. It's quite striking when you go back to the COVID crisis in the early stages. It was India that proposed, not only SAARC summit. India was proposing a virtual G20 summit. But if you look at the Western countries, they were so involved within themselves, erecting barriers, locking themselves down, sealing themselves off, that the whole conversation was about, me, myself. And the idea became that, look, first we have to take care of ourselves, and which is perhaps fine in the short term, but it also then leaves you open for the kind of vulnerabilities that we are witnessing, and China comes in and fills that vacuum. So my sense is that once this crisis flattens out, once you see relative stability emerging in the global order, I think it can go either way at this point, because you can certainly look at China and you can see how powerful it is. But also, I think there are serious questions being asked of China. So clearly, once the crisis subsides, we can see two kinds of debates happening. Whether it's a unilateral path to Chinese-led global order, or there is going to be an even strikingly more powerful pushback because of the kinds of costs that the world is going to bear because of the Chinese opaqueness.
Yeah, so it's clearly a disorder that is very, very visible now. Before we come to India's role, I want to just discuss the global supply chain. most of the countries do not have a choice. And we saw that in the beginning, I put forward a question: will China's relationship with the Western world go back to normal once this is over? But there's also a lot of debate going on whether the over-dependence on on China in terms of the global supply chain, what should be done about that? Will there be effort to loosen China's grip on the global supply chain? Because there are already in the US Congress, there is a discussion to bring the manufacture of essential medicines back to the US. Currently, it's shocking that 97% of all its antibiotics US gets from China. This is really very worrisome.
Yes, I think the numbers are quite striking, and then they apply for most a large part of the world. So it's quite true that that this is a critical and we never thought of this as a critical infrastructure for a long time. And we used to talk of military technologies, emerging technologies, never pharmaceuticals. So I think now that you are at a stage where even pharmaceuticals, even health has become a strategic problem among major powers. Clearly, you are going to see a shift. Already there was a shift. Already Americans have been talking of this decoupling between Americans and the Chinese economies. And I think that is certainly going to go forward. I think that there are going to be questions in the West, in the larger West, about what is to be done about this over-dependence. And I think there are questions to be asked even in countries like India that can be really, this whole paradigm that dependence and interdependence is good. I think that is being challenged in some fundamental ways. Whether, the liberal idea that interdependence leads to greater transparency, we are seeing exactly the opposite happening. We are seeing China using some of its strengths quite for leverage purposes. So I think the debate was already beginning to happen before Corona came on board. My sense is that this debate is going to accentuate, is going to accelerate, and countries, especially major powers who can afford to take these decisions, will decide that perhaps shortening the supply lines is a good strategy. We cannot really rely on the Chinese on strategic matters, on strategic industries, and health becomes part of that debate, because till now the assumption was that this is a softer issue, this is a non-traditional issue, we really don't want to bother about it. It's a military and emerging technologies, critical technologies that are more important. Now you are seeing pharmaceuticals being added to that list,
along with emerging technologies and military equipment, of course. And India's outreach in the very beginning, in fact, was much appreciated. India's outreach to SAARC and also its proactive role in G20. But the pandemic has raised governance challenges in emerging economies. Do you think, can India rise to the occasion?
I think India perhaps has shown that, given its limited capacities even today, it is able to play a kind of a mobiliser role in the region, in the international community, to an extent that perhaps many thought India's shy of playing. So in the short term, we have played that role to good effect. The fact that we could mobilize SAARC nations, the fact that we could talk of G20, Mr. Modi could take leadership in that forum at a time when no one else was talking about these issues, I think shows that there is a paucity of leadership on the global stage, and many also would appreciate India stepping up to the plate and playing that role. The question is, can we sustain that? Given that we are entering into a phase where Indian capacities would also go weaker along with the other countries. India would also have to first take care of its own internal problems, domestic problems, and the way governance internal governance would demand full-time attention of Indian policymakers after the crisis subsides. I think these are profound questions for any nation, especially for a country as big as India, especially for a population with the kind of population density we have. So clearly, once you go forward and you map out the terrain that India has to on the internal governance that India has to tackle, the question would be that whether Indian policymaking community, whether Indian policymakers would have the bandwidth to also then talk of larger regional and global issues. So far, Indian policymakers have shown that they do want to raise that issue. After all, in South Asia, given our neighborhood, we can't really afford to be isolationists in that context. But I think beyond South Asia, beyond BIMSTEC and SAARC, whether India wants to be play a bigger role in, say, G20. I think it was a striking, a lot of the comments in the G20 summit, which I was going through. I think Mr. Modi's comments were quite striking, because he was talking, he was one of the few people one of the few leaders who talked of larger humanitarian issues. He also talked of how we need to redefine the concept of globalization, because not simply in financial terms, not simply in economic terms, but also in fundamental terms about the larger social and political aspects and the externalities that it generates. So clearly, I think there is a recognition in India that India needs to step up to the plate. The question is whether it will have the bandwidth, whether the forthcoming governance challenges would not overwhelm it to a point where it becomes more inward-looking. I hope not, but we don't know. I think everything is up in the air at this point.
Yes. And I think once the current pandemic is over, the globe must learn lessons about what happened and how international systems, international institutions can be strengthened. There is a need. We've been pointing out, we've been talking about it, how the disorder in the global order is so visible, so apparent. So how can all these be fixed and radically reformed in order to forestall its recurrence? That you think is very, very important. It will be very important to relook at all of this, of the functioning.
Absolutely. And I think, sometimes you need a crisis to galvanize public opinion. You need a crisis to galvanize international structures. I mean, present day international structures, we know they came into existence only after Second World War. It's a post-Bretton Woods international institutional architecture that we are living with. Perhaps, and we have been talking about this for quite some time now, that time has come to reinvigorate that. I think the question will still remain, who will bell the cat? And the question will still remain, who takes the leadership role? And whether at one point China was projecting itself as a responsible global stakeholder. Can we still rely on China to be that responsible global stakeholder? Or does the rest of the world need to come together and question some of these Chinese attempts at sabotaging the ability of the international community to come and work together? It would have been relatively easy for Chinese to showcase their positive leadership in the early stages of this crisis. As evidence mounts, it's becoming increasingly clear that Chinese have played a double game, and that there are lots of questions that they need to answer, and they need to be, and the international community is increasingly becoming cognizant of that reality. So the challenge for the international community would be, how do you bring various stakeholders together to frame a kind of response that you were suggesting earlier?
Thank you so much for that, for those inputs, Harsh. So the big question is, and there is a challenge for the international community, and the big question is, who will take the leadership role? That's a question in front of the world community. And if the pandemic upends the world as we know it, China's role, the world order, China's role will be a key trigger. And the question is, who can be a responsible global stakeholder? Thank you so much for joining us in this episode of the Ideas Factory.